So hydrogen bonds are another type of bond. Remember I said this is the weakest kind of bond. It's like the one-night stand of bonding. And hydrogen bonds form between polar covalent molecules, or molecules, polar molecules that we were talking about earlier. So remember earlier I said that, hold on, I get my pen here. Water, for example, is formed by polar covalent bonds, and that the electrons are shared unequally because oxygen is an electron bully. So because electron pulls electrons close to itself, it ends up with a partial negative charge. Hydrogen is getting the electrons pulled away from it, so it ends up with a partial positive charge. And so this is a polar molecule because it has polar covalent bonds. It has these partial charges on either side of the bond. Polar molecules can then form hydrogen bonds between each other. So for example, I might have a water molecule like this, and if it comes near another water molecule or another polar molecule, so I'm going to draw in another water molecule here. Remember that when I was talking about polar covalent bonds, I said that polar molecules are sticky. So this has a partial negative charge. It's sticky. It wants to stick to partial positive charges. So let me draw in my partial positive charges here. So if two water molecules get near each other like this, the sticky part of the oxygen and the sticky part of the hydrogen will stick to each other because they match, positive to negative. And what will form between them is a hydrogen bond. So a hydrogen bond is indicated, like here, with a dotted line. The dotted line helps remind us, or to indicates how weak this bond is. So this bond is forming here for a split second, and then it will break as the water molecules move. So if you think about a glass of water, you have these hydrogen bonds forming between the thousands and thousands and thousands of water molecules in that glass of water. They're moving around, they'll hydrogen bond to each other, and then they'll separate from each other, and the hydrogen bond will break. So this is always happening when polar molecules are in contact with each other. They touch each other, they make a hydrogen bond, and then they break. And this is why polar molecules will dissolve into water. So you may know the rule like dissolves like. So when we talk about water, only other polar or charged molecules will dissolve into water because of this polarity and the ability to form hydrogen bonds. So ammonia, for example, will dissolve into water because ammonia is also a polar molecule. So one polar molecule and another polar molecule can interact with each other through these hydrogen bonds. So here's the partial positive on the water here. Nitrogen has a partial negative, and so when they come near each other, a hydrogen bond can form. As I said earlier, the hydrogen bonds are depicted with a dotted line or a dash. And again, that just helps remind us that it's a very weak bond and short-lived. Even though hydrogen bonds are weak and short-lived, if you have lots and lots of them, they can be very strong. So this molecule here is DNA, and all the way running down your DNA, and I should have drawn hash lines there, but all running down the center of this DNA molecule here, you have hundreds and thousands of hydrogen bonds. So thousands of hydrogen bonds hold DNA together, and it actually makes DNA very, very stable. This is why it can be collected from crime scenes or from crime samples 50 years later, is because it's so stable. In water, right, you have lots and lots of water molecules forming hydrogen bonds with each other, and this makes water be extremely stable. So water actually takes longer to boil, for example, than many other liquids. Like if you were to boil alcohol, for example, it's not very hard to do. You can just bring it to a very low temperature and it will start to evaporate. But water, on the other hand, you have to get to a very high temperature because water, hydrogen bonding to itself, makes it really want to stick together, makes it very hard for it to separate. Weak bonds like hydrogen bonds can also be advantageous because when you're weak, you're reversible. That means it can form and reform easily. So form and break easily. And when you look at living things, the majority of what we do in our bodies, we want to be reversible. So things will come together, they'll hang out together for a couple of seconds or a minute even, and then they'll separate. And so most of what happens in our bodies is short-lived for good reason, and hydrogen bonds are very good for that. So if we look at this image here, we have two water molecules, and if this were in a glass of water, why would this be really unlikely, and what would be more likely? If you think about it, this is about charges. Whoops, sorry. So remember, the oxygen has a partial negative charge, hydrogens have a partial positive charge. Now you may know that not only do opposites attract, but in fact like repels here. So two water molecules are unlikely to arrange like this because this is putting positive next to positive. Water molecules are going to tend to interact with each other. So if I redraw this the way it would tend to be, they're going to stagger so that I can have the partial positive and the partial negative next to each other, and a hydrogen bond can form between them. So that is what is favored thermodynamically, or by principles of the universe, if you will. All right, so that's hydrogen bonds.